All right, let me check if I'm filming. I am. Excellent. All right. Hello again, everyone. It is Wednesday. I'm totally exhausted. Um, we are going to get through this, so help me. One of the side effects of COVID, even though I am now officially free of the virus, which is super good news, um, the fatigue, though, definitely lasts. So I have to I sleep a ridiculous amount every night, sometimes up to 12 hours, and then I still have to take a several hours long afternoon nap every day. Um, I am like at my napping point, but I want to film another video and get it uploading while I take my nap so that you guys have it and so that we're just one little bit closer. Um, so we're going to pick back up on slide 18. This is now where we are talking about the neuroscience of kind of these mystical experiences that are tied to spirituality and religious experience. So we often hear about these rare experiences that people have where they're like, I had this totally religious experience or a mystical experience that can't be explained, where they believe that they've really like touched into, that supernatural world. And I'm sure you've probably heard stories, either anecdotally. I feel like maybe every family has that one person who feels like they've experienced that. Or you've just heard from somebody or have seen this in the media at some point. Um, and these experiences, they are rare. Um, and they're usually, very profound for that person, extremely, distinctive and outside of their usual realm of reality. Um, and they are often very difficult for them to describe in words. It's more of an expression of feeling and emotion and more of a state of knowing and being. Our book really describes them through that emotionality, and that they last around 30 minutes or so and often make the person feel like they've almost been like carried away by, a force that's much larger than themselves. Um, when I think of this type of mystical experience being described, one of the first things that I think of from my own religious tradition is the night ride. Um, so for any of you who know a little bit of background about Islam, there is a tradition that the Prophet Muhammad was taken up on this like journey with the angel. I think Gabriel was the angel who took him on this journey to basically go through and see heaven. And you hear that with different, prophets and religious leaders through history, that they've had, these type of experiences that are completely outside of the realm of understanding. Um, and they become codified in our history as well. And, we as modern people using science try to understand them, but it's very difficult to do so. Um, so when these happen, to people now, they can feel like, a stroke of insight or a sudden appreciation of something as well. Looking at slide 19, there can be different models of mystical experiences. And some of them look at things like the passage of time. So, mentioning that, they often last about 30 minutes or so. How space feels different, how the physical world seems to manifest differently, um, and how you as an individual seem to no longer fit into reality in quite the same way. So let's look at slide 20 and think about how this fits into our understanding of neuroscience. So there are different kind of hypotheses about maybe what is occurring here. when somebody goes through a mystical experience and what is happening on a psychological and neuroscientific, level. So one hypothesis that's been thrown around actually for hundreds of years before people even really understood what was happening was that these could be seizures. Going back to my example I gave from my own religious tradition, many people during the 600 ADs actually thought that that the Prophet Muhammad had epilepsy for how he had these mystical experiences. So this is not a new phenomenon as a hypothesis. So there's an idea that temporal lobe epilepsy or seizures may be involved in these mystical experiences to, basically bring on this hyper emotionality, these abstract semantic ideas. Because remember, your temporal lobe, especially if you're having left temporal epilepsy, you're going to have, some type of semantic word involvement. And that it could also bring up different, maybe visual imagery. And then there's the idea that different people with right temporal lobe epilepsy, so opposite side, they often describe different hallucinations that they experience in often mystical or spiritual terms that they report after having seizures. So this is one hypothesis that's often provided. Another thing is that the brain is equipped for spiritual experiences, and it could be just as readily seen as evidence for the perceiving reality at a spiritual level, and that we've adapted for that. So evolutionary science kind of assumes that the brain adapted to be able to pick up information from our environment and find what was really important to us, important for our survival or understanding the world, and that can feed in to mystical experiences. This would not tie in as much to that temporal lobe epilepsy. And also, you can't really reduce all spiritual experiences to temporal lobe epilepsy, because not everybody is having those seizures. And also, epileptics experience the same hallucinations without the same intense feelings or knowing a hidden truth. I'll be the first to say that I have experienced temporal lobe epilepsy with absolutely no spiritual connections to them. More, I just feel like I am falling down, and the most I can do is just say, whoa. And then I'm like, all right, well, that was great. Not really. So, you have to think, well, maybe seizures could explain some spiritual and mystical experiences, but they can't explain all. It definitely, when you also think that a lot of people who have those also don't experience any of the mystical experiences. There's also a hypothesis about hallucinations and delusions of psychosis. So a study by Saver and Rabin in 1997 kind of thought about how maybe there could be a subtype of psychosis of delusional experience where you go into mystical states, and it kind of, they hypothesize that psychosis could lead to hallucinations, and that you would deduce that you had gone through a spiritual experience, and that this could be due to different neurological factors as well. But once again, this explanation is also incomplete. So we have different hypotheses, but none of them fully explain all of these experiences. So moving on to slide 21, there's the executive inhibition hypothesis. For this slide, it's fairly straightforward. It's pretty text heavy. But basically, so we have studies that have looked at the relationship between the executive functioning and its activation, and then different aspects of mystical experiences. So how is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain, how is its lower activation and its response to these maybe suggestions of authoritarianism that may come along with religious rituals? How can that be connected with mystical experiences? And so some of the things that they've found is that they did have decreased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that happened during prayers, so prayer or meditation that you find in different religions, and that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was more strongly activated, so higher activation in people who are skeptical, people who don't cling as heavily to spirituality and religion than those who do. So there is that idea that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is very connected to executive functioning, may have a role to play here. So one more thing to keep in mind. The last slide for this video, just kind of further looking at this, is slide 22. It's that Cristofori et al. 2016 slide. This looks at some lesions in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and how that there is a mysticism scale that is used in this study. So it's basically a scale that looks at different items of mysticism, and these different items can be things like feelings of unity, sacredness, joy, a sense of transcending time and space, your intuitive beliefs. So all of these different kind of experiences that can go along with spirituality and religion, and how you objectively look at truth and reality. And so they looked at that mysticism scale. They looked at dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, and they had this hypothesis that mystical experiences were regulated by these key regions within the frontal and temporal cortices, and that if you had impairment to especially like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that would end up being associated with greater mystical experiences because of its role in regulating things like inhibition, and also that previous information on the last slide about how when it's deactivated, you're more likely to have a response to religious authority and a belief in supernatural phenomenon, and even are more likely to fall into hypnotic suggestion. And so they looked at temporal cortex lesions, and they found that they were associated with fewer mystical experiences due to the temporal cortex role in generating mystical experiences. So basically, when you break this all down, if you have less activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you're going to be more likely to fall into this category of possibly having mystical experiences. And then on the opposite end, if you have lesions to the temporal cortex, you're going to be less likely to have these mystical experiences, because the temporal cortex is necessary in having a mystical experience. So it's almost like, all right, you want a mystical experience? Well, that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we gotta lower it down, And the temporal cortex, all right, well, we gotta up that a bit. And then maybe you can get one, but still rare. So basically, when we look at slide 22, it's just some evidence that helps to feed into what we saw in slide 21 for the executive inhibition hypothesis. Anyway, that is enough for this video. I need a nap so bad. COVID fatigue is no joke, dudes. So I hope you all are still like able to stay at home as much as you can. I hope none of you have gotten it yet. If you have though, hit me up. I've posted some videos on this academic channel about some of my experiences, and yesterday actually had an NPR reporter over at my house and gave an interview about my COVID experience. I will give you guys the link once that is up in the next week, because I'm going to be part of their segment on that. So hopefully that'll help share a little bit of what it is like to go through this. If you are interested, and if you are not because you are overwhelmed and inundated by COVID stuff, I totally get it. Like, go find something else to do. It's okay. All right, bye.